On February 9th, 2019, at 6:47 in the morning, 3 black SUVs came up my access road. Not local law enforcement, not wildlife services. I had made enough phone calls over the years, been turned away by enough agencies to recognize federal vehicles by the way they move, unhurried, certain, the particular arrogance of people who have never once needed to knock. I was standing on my porch when they arrived. I had been standing there since 4 in the morning, actually, because the motion sensor on the lower barn had triggered twice in the night, and I knew it wasn't deer. I had a thermos of coffee that had gone cold. I was wearing the same flannel jacket I'd worn for most of the last 2 years. And I was thinking about Bodhi. That's what I called him, Bodhi. The name came to me in the 3rd winter when I finally accepted that what was living in the lower ravine of my property was not leaving, was not a danger, and was, in ways I was only beginning to understand. Something I had an obligation toward. Bodhi, from the Sanskrit, it means awakening. I had been hiding a living Yeti on my property in the Cascade foothills of Washington State for 40 years. Not hiding him from my neighbors, exactly. I had no neighbors close enough to matter. Hiding him from the world, from the machinery of documentation and classification and exploitation that I knew with absolute certainty would be set into motion the moment his existence became official. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head for most of those 40 years. The way it would start, what they would say, what I would say back. The arguments I had prepared and the ones I had discarded as too emotional to be useful. I had a lawyer's name on a piece of paper in my shirt pocket. I had put it there 3 days earlier when I understood the timeline had compressed beyond my ability to manage it alone. The agents got out of their vehicles. There were 7 of them. The one who walked toward me first was a woman in her 40s, composed with the kind of face that has learned not to show what it is thinking. She introduced herself and showed me credentials I read carefully. She said, "Mr. Calhoun, we need to talk about what you have on this property." I said, "I know. Come inside. I've been expecting you for about 35 years. She paused at that, just briefly, and I thought, good. A person who can be surprised is a person I can talk to. I bought the property in 1978 with an inheritance from my grandfather and a level of deliberateness that I can only fully appreciate in retrospect. I was 32 years old, a former Forest Service ranger who had left the agency over a disagreement about logging permits that I won't bore you with, except to say it clarified permanently my views on institutional land management. I wanted 60 acres of old-growth Cascade forest, a cabin, a creek, and to be left alone. I got all of those things. I also got Bodhi, though I didn't know that yet. The property sat in a fold of the foothills that the logging companies had passed over in the 1940s and 1950s, not out of ecological conscience, but because the terrain made extraction impractical. The old-growth Douglas firs in the lower ravine were the largest I had seen outside of a national park, some of them 4 and 5 feet in diameter, their canopies so dense that the ground beneath them was almost perpetually damp, carpeted in moss and fern and the particular stillness of places that have not been disturbed in a very long time. The cabin was small and needed work. I spent the first 2 years doing that work, learning the land, and being alone with the silence that I had. It turned out genuinely needed after 6 years of institutional employment. My ex-wife Carol had told me when I left the Ranger Service that I was running away from the world. She was half right. I was running toward a different part of it. The first indication came in the autumn of 1979, 14 months after I moved in. I was running a trap line, checking it, not actually trapping. I'd moved to camera monitoring by then. Along the eastern edge of the property, where the old growth gave way to second growth hemlock, the cameras had been triggering at night, and I couldn't identify what was setting them off. What I found on an October morning with the ground fog still thick in the hollows was a section of trail that had been cleared, not by windfall or erosion. Cleared. Branches removed, moved to the sides. The path widened in a way that made no sense for any animal I knew of in this ecosystem. The work had been done sometime in the previous 48 hours. I followed the cleared section for about 200 yards until it ended at the base of a large Douglas fir. At the base of the tree, arranged with a neatness that stopped me cold, were the contents of a supply cache I had left 6 weeks earlier and assumed a black bear had ransacked. Canned goods stacked by size, the empty can set in a separate pile, a length of rope coiled, a folded tarpaulin. Something organized this, I wrote in my notebook that evening, something that understands the difference between useful and used up. I saw Bodhi for the first time on March 14th, 1981. I know the date precisely because I had been in town the day before for supplies, and the radio in the hardware store was playing wall-to-wall coverage of the attempted assassination of President Reagan. I drove home thinking about vulnerability, about how quickly the world can lurch, about the illusion of security. I went to bed thinking about these things. At around 3 in the morning, I heard the sound that I had been hearing intermittently for 2 years without being able to source it. A low, structured vocalization, not quite resonant enough to be a roar, too deliberate and varied to be wind. I had recorded it 11 times in my audio journals and played it back endlessly without reaching a conclusion. I dressed without turning on a light and went to the window. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, approximately 40 feet from the cabin, in the partial moonlight. My first impression, and I have thought about why this was my first impression rather than fear, was of composure. He was not lurking, he was not threatening, he was standing in the manner of someone who has arrived somewhere and is waiting with patience to be acknowledged. The height I estimated at 8 feet, possibly slightly more. The build was massive across the shoulders and chest, with arms that hung lower than a human's proportions would suggest. The fur was a deep, dark brown with reddish undertones, not the muddy gray of a bear, not any color I had a prior reference for. The face was broad and deeply weathered, with a heavy brow ridge and a jaw that conveyed enormous physical power. But it was the eyes I could not stop documenting. They were dark, deeply dark, the way very old wood is dark, the way certain kinds of grief look from the outside. And they were fixed on me with an intelligence that I can only describe as mutual, not the reactive intelligence of a threatened animal, the settled intelligence of something that has thought about this moment in advance. The way it observed me, calculating, deciding, wasn't merely animalistic. It was deliberate. It was the look of something that had chosen to be seen. We looked at each other for what my memory insists was close to 10 minutes, but my rational mind suspects was closer to 3. Then he turned and walked back into the tree line, not running, walking, unhurried, with a specific quality of departure that says, "I will be back." This was an introduction. I sat down on the floor of the cabin and did not move for a long time. I was not frightened. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something closer to the feeling you get when you realize a situation is significantly larger than you had understood it to be. Not panic, but a recalibration. A sense of the ground shifting to accommodate something new. I want to be honest about the decision I made in 1983 because it was not simple and it was not made once. It was made repeatedly over the course of about 18 months as the reality of what I was sharing this land with became undeniable. By the spring of 1983, I had documented 47 separate interactions, sightings, evidence of activity, vocalizations, exchanges of objects in 7 notebooks. I had taken 11 photographs, none of which were clear enough to constitute definitive proof, but all of which were consistent with the physical reality I was observing. I had, in short, enough documentation to make a credible report to the wildlife authorities. I did not make that report. Here's why this changed everything for me. I had spent 6 years as a federal ranger. I understood exactly what would happen if I did. The property would be cordoned. Federal wildlife teams would arrive, followed by scientific teams, followed by the media, followed by everyone the media brings in its wake. Bodhi, the creature I was coming to understand as a being of profound intelligence and deep territorial knowledge, who had lived in and around this land for what I estimated, from the Chinook oral accounts I had begun researching, to be at least 3 generations, would be captured, studied, classified, and managed. In the best case, in the worst case, which I thought about with a clarity that kept me awake, he would be killed during capture, or die in captivity, or become the subject of a dispute between agencies and universities and governments that would outlast any individual's ability to protect him. What most people don't understand is that the discovery of a new species is, for the species, almost never good news. We do not have a strong track record. I also understood something more personal and harder to articulate, that what was happening between Bodhi and me on this land was unprecedented. Whatever this relationship was becoming, and in 1983 I was still in the early stages of understanding its dimensions, it was fragile in the specific way that all genuinely new things are fragile. It could not survive being turned into a news event. It could not survive the institutional attention that official disclosure would trigger. It needed, above all else, time and quiet. So I made the decision that I have lived with for 40 years. I would tell no one. I would protect the land. I would protect him. And I would document everything in the private record that I have kept in a fireproof box under the floor of my cabin since 1984, against the day when the telling might do more good than harm. 22 notebooks by the time the federal agents took them, each one numbered, dated, cross-referenced with the audio recordings I kept on a separate system. Over 350,000 words of observation, analysis, and reflection. I know the approximate word count because I counted once in 2007 during a long winter when Bodhi's range had shifted northward and I had fewer sightings to document and more time to look back at what I'd accumulated. The notebooks document everything from the purely behavioral to the genuinely inexplicable. Let me give you some of what's in them, because the federal agents read all of it before they came up my road. And I think that's why the conversation went the way it went. The behavioral record spans 4 decades of territorial patterns, seasonal movements, dietary observations, and what I came to call social signaling, the specific ways Bodhi communicated his presence, his intentions, and, I believe, his emotional states through combinations of vocalization, object placement, and physical positioning. I developed a rough taxonomy of his vocalizations over the first decade, 11 distinct types that I could reliably distinguish, each associated with consistent contextual patterns. The low resonant hum that preceded his appearances near the cabin, the sharp rising call that functioned as a territorial marker, the softer, more modulated sounds he made when I was working in the field and he was nearby but not visible, sounds that I eventually understood as a form of companionable acknowledgement. I am here. You are here. This is fine. The object exchanges filled 2 full notebooks on their own. Beginning in 1986, Bodhi began leaving things at the cabin that were not food. A large, unusually smooth stone that I still have on my desk. A section of bark from a Pacific yew, stripped in a pattern I had seen him use to mark boundaries, but never before directed at a human structure. Once, in the winter of 1991, a feather from a species I could not immediately identify. I sent a photograph to an ornithologist friend at the University of Washington without context, and he identified it as a marbled murrelet primary, a bird then in the process of being listed as threatened due to old-growth logging. I have thought about the significance of that particular gift many times. The most significant section of the notebooks, and the one I believe most affected Dr. Voss when she read it, covers what I can only call the evidence of historical awareness. Beginning around 1995, I started finding things near the large fir at the eastern boundary that I could not explain as natural deposition. Fragments of what appeared to be worked stone, too small and too weathered to identify with certainty, but arranged in ways consistent with intentional placement. Animal bones that had been cleaned and set in specific orientations. On 2 occasions, arrangements of old-growth sections of fallen trees that formed enclosures too deliberate to be windfall. My experience revealed something profound when I began researching the regional Chinook and Chehalis oral traditions, descriptions of the creature they knew, the Siatko in some accounts, by other names in others, as a keeper of places, a being that maintained certain locations across generations, that remembered the landscape in a time frame no individual human lifespan could match. I documented the parallels between the oral descriptions and what I was observing on my own 60 acres with the careful neutrality of a scientist who knows that confirmation bias is the greatest enemy of honest observation. The parallels were exact. Too exact for me to dismiss and too significant for me to overstate. I will not give you all 40 years in detail because 40 years is a life, and a life resists summary. But I want to give you the shape of it because the shape matters for understanding what was at stake when the federal agents arrived on my porch. Bodhi and I developed what I can only describe as a territorial understanding during the mid-1980s. He had ranges, areas of the property, and the adjacent Forest Service land that he used at different seasons, and I learned them. I adjusted my own movements accordingly. When I needed to work in an area he was using, I developed a specific signal. 3 slow knocks on a tree trunk spaced about 5 seconds apart. Within 6 months, he had begun responding, not always by vacating, sometimes by making himself visible at a distance that said, "Clearly, I am here. Adjust." By 1990, the adjustment went both ways. When I was ill one winter, a chest infection that kept me in the cabin for 11 days, I found food left at my door on 4 separate mornings. Wild mushrooms, a dressed rabbit, once, impossibly, a piece of honeycomb still in the wax, left on the porch step, wrapped in a large leaf like something packaged. I documented each item and its placement in my journal. I ate the honeycomb. It seemed rude not to. My observations consistently showed over decades that Bodhi's intelligence was not static. It grew, or rather, and I think this is more accurate, my understanding of its complexity grew as I developed better frameworks for observing it. What I had initially read as simple territorial behavior, I came to understand as something closer to stewardship. He managed the land. Old growth sections that should have been degrading by succession were not. Invasive species that I had been fighting manually for years disappeared from areas he frequented. The creek ran cleaner in the sections of the property he used most heavily. I am a trained observer. I do not say these things carelessly. I documented all of it. The hardest years were the ones when logging came close to the property boundary. 1994 and again in 2003. I watched Bodhi's behavior change during those periods in ways I had not seen before and hope never to see again. The deliberate composure I had come to associate with him gave way to something that I can only describe as grief. He ranged less. He came to the cabin more. He stood at the southern fence line for hours, those enormous hands resting on the cedar posts, looking toward the sound of the equipment in the valley below. I filed 3 formal objections to the logging permits. I hired a lawyer for the second one. I lost both times. He stayed. I do not know what that cost him. I know what it would have cost me. Keeping a secret for 40 years is not a single act of will. It is a daily practice, and like all daily practices, it had its failures. Moments when the margin between discovery and concealment narrowed to something that, looking back, still makes my hands unsteady. The first serious close call came in the summer of 1988. A group of hikers, 4 young men college-aged, with the specific recklessness of people who have never been truly lost, came off the trail on the adjacent Forest Service land and ended up on my property's eastern edge after dark. I became aware of them from the cabin because Bodhi had shifted his vocalization pattern in a way I had learned to read as agitation, the tight, clipped sounds he made when something entered his immediate range without the warning signals he had come to expect. I went out with a flashlight and intercepted them at the old fir before they got deeper in. I told them they were on private land, pointed them back toward the trail, and watched them leave. One of them, a kid with a headlamp and more curiosity than sense, paused at the edge of my flashlight's range and said, "Did you hear that? There's something big in those trees." I told him it was elk. He seemed satisfied with this. He left. Bodhi had been standing approximately 60 feet behind me in the darkness the entire time. I know this because when I turned around after the hikers were gone, his silhouette was visible against the faint ambient light filtering through the canopy. He was motionless. He had been motionless, I realized, from the moment I arrived, as though he had understood that my presence meant he should be still. After a moment, he turned and moved back into the forest without a sound. That exchange, the implicit coordination of it, the trust it implied on his part, is one I have returned to many times in the years since. He had trusted me to handle the situation. He had adjusted his behavior based on my presence in a way that could only be explained by a sophisticated understanding of what I was doing and why. The second close call was more serious. In October 2001, a wildlife photographer named Dennis Haas spent 4 days camped on the Forest Service boundary, a quarter-mile from my eastern fence line. He was shooting mountain goats on the upper ridge, and by the second day had clearly noticed something in the lower forest that interested him more. I could see his telephoto lens from my porch tracking the tree line. I spent those 4 days in a state of controlled tension that I document in Notebook 14. With an honesty I find difficult to read now, I moved through the property's eastern section repeatedly, making noise, disrupting the patterns that Bodhi's presence would have established. I used the knock signal to redirect him away from the fence line. I left his usual food deposits further north than normal, drawing his range toward the interior of the property. Haas got nothing useful. On his fourth morning, he packed up and left. In his subsequent article in a Pacific Northwest outdoor magazine, I found it 6 months later and read it 3 times, he described the lower forest on my boundary as unusually active, with evidence of a large mammal presence I was unable to identify conclusively. That phrase, unable to identify conclusively, is the closest I came to exposure before 2016. It is a phrase I have genuine gratitude for. The third close call was my own fault, and it is the one I am least proud of. In 2009, I allowed a woman I had been seeing for several months, a retired school teacher named Margaret, who I had met at the county library, and whose intelligence and discretion I trusted, or thought I trusted, to spend a weekend at the cabin. I had managed the risk carefully, I believed. I had redirected Bodhi's range for the 2 weeks prior. I had left no unusual evidence near the cabin. On the second morning, Margaret came in from the porch with an expression I recognized immediately as the expression of someone who has just seen something they cannot categorize. She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Ray, there is something standing in your meadow, and it is not a bear." I told her it was a bear, seen at bad angle in the morning light. I said it calmly and with the conviction of someone who has been maintaining a specific story for 30 years. She looked at me in the way that perceptive people look at you when they know you are lying, but have decided, for reasons of their own, not to press it. She never came back to the cabin. We remained friendly for several years afterward. She never mentioned it again. I have always wondered what she actually saw, and whether the version in her memory grew or shrank with the years. I was not betrayed. I want to say that clearly before I explain what happened, because the word betrayed implies malice, and what actually occurred was more ordinary and more forgivable than malice. In 2016, my nephew Marcus visited for a week in August. Marcus is 34 years old, a good man, and constitutionally incapable of being in the presence of something extraordinary without reaching for his phone. He had been on the property for 4 days when he saw Bodhi at the edge of the lower meadow at dusk. I did not know he had seen anything until he left. He did not tell me, I think because some part of him understood from 40 years of watching me guard this land with an intensity that must have seemed eccentric, that telling me would result in a conversation he wasn't prepared for. So he said nothing. He drove back to Seattle. He posted a single photograph on a private social media account 2 weeks later. He had 14 followers. He captioned it, "Uncle Ray's Place, something in the tree line, not a bear." That photograph, blurry, shot in low light on a phone, the kind of image that would be laughed off any serious cryptid research forum, was screenshot by one of his 14 followers, who sent it to a Bigfoot research group. Within 72 hours, it was on 3 separate cryptid websites. Within 2 weeks, it had been reverse geolocated by someone with more technical skill than I had anticipated. Within 6 months, I had been visited by 2 separate groups of researchers who I turned away, one documentary crew that I threatened with trespass charges, and one individual, a retired fish and wildlife biologist, who sat in his truck at the end of my road for 9 hours before I went down and asked him, politely, to leave. He left, but he had already made the calls. Property had appeared in their monitoring files as early as 2004, flagged by a Forest Service employee who had noticed the unusual boundary between my land and the adjacent federal forest. The way the old growth on my property maintained a health and density that the surrounding land did not. They had watched at a distance for 15 years. The photograph gave them a timeline. The lead agent's name was Dr. Sarah Voss. She was, as I came to understand over the following days, not primarily a law enforcement officer. She held a doctorate in evolutionary biology from the University of Washington and had spent the previous 8 years attached to a federal interagency task force whose existence, she told me on the first morning, had never been publicly acknowledged. I made her coffee. She accepted it. We sat at my kitchen table, and she laid out what they knew, which was, I will admit this surprised me, considerably more than I had expected. They had the photograph. They had the geolocation. They had, from thermal imaging conducted via drone on 4 separate nights in November and December 2018, while I was unaware of their surveillance, confirmation of a large bipedal heat signature moving through the lower ravine and the old growth section on a regular schedule. They had pulled my land records, my ranger service file, my library checkout history for the previous 20 years. And they had. Dr. Voss told me with a directness I found myself respecting despite everything, my notebooks. A federal warrant had been executed while I was in town 2 days earlier. They had the fireproof box. I sat with that for a moment. 35 years of documentation, every interaction, every observation, every carefully dated entry, the most complete record of sustained human contact with an undiscovered species that had ever been assembled, removed from my floor while I was buying groceries. "How much of it did you read?" I asked. "All of it," she said. And then, after a pause that I have thought about many times since, "Mr. Calhoun, I need you to understand that I came here because I was sent here. But I also came here because of what I read in those notebooks. And what I read changed what I think needs to happen next." I looked at her for a long time. I had spent 40 years being suspicious of institutions and the people who worked within them. I had left a federal agency because I had watched it prioritize convenience over principle with a consistency that eventually became intolerable. I was not predisposed to trust the person sitting across my kitchen table, regardless of what she said. But there was something in the way she said it. What I read changed what I think needs to happen next, not what we need to do. The institutional plural. What I think, the personal singular. A scientist telling me, carefully and within the constraints of her role, that reading my notebooks had moved something in her that official procedure had not anticipated. I poured us both more coffee. Then I said, "Tell me exactly what you're authorized to propose. Here is what I had expected based on 40 years of imagining this conversation. Containment. Capture. A clinical process executed with professional efficiency in which Bodhi would be tranquilized, transported, and delivered to a facility where he would spend the remainder of his life being studied by people who would never understand what I had spent 4 decades learning about him. Here is what Dr. Voss actually proposed. The task force, officially designated under an obscure subsection of the Endangered Species Act that she explained in terms I mostly followed, had the authority to establish what she called a protected research corridor, a formal federal designation that would, in effect, do what I had been doing informally for 40 years: protect the land, restrict access, and document the inhabitant without disturbing him. The difference, she said, was enforcement. My protection had always been contingent on my continued presence, my continued health, my continued ability to hold the line against a world that was increasingly capable of finding things it hadn't been invited to find. Federal designation would survive me. What most people don't understand is that I had thought about this. I had thought about it every year as I got older, as my knees got worse, as I watched the technology for finding things improve at a rate I could not outpace. I had a plan, the notebooks, a letter to a specific lawyer, instructions for a trust. But I had known for years that the plan was fragile, that it depended on a sequence of events going right that had many opportunities to go wrong. Dr. Voss was offering me something I had wanted for 30 years and stopped believing was possible: institutional protection that did not require Bodhi's capture. The cost, she explained, was disclosure. Not public disclosure. The task force operated outside public reporting requirements, but disclosure to the federal record. Bodhi's existence would be officially documented, classified at the highest level, and the property would be managed accordingly. I would remain. I would continue my role. I would be, in effect, formalized. There would be monitoring equipment. There would be periodic visits from cleared researchers. There would be a reporting protocol and a chain of accountability that extended well beyond any single individual's lifespan or political administration. She slid a document across the table, 47 pages. I asked for a week to read it. She gave me 4 days. I signed on February 14th, 2019. Valentine's Day, which I mention only because Bodhi had left a cluster of early blooming trilliums on the porch step that morning. He had been doing this every February for over a decade, a pattern I had documented but never been able to fully explain. And the coincidence felt like something. The changes to the property were incremental and, to my relief, largely invisible. New fencing along the eastern boundary, designated as a wildlife management perimeter. Monitoring equipment installed at agreed-upon locations. I had approval over placement, a condition I had negotiated on the second day. A small structure built at the edge of the old-growth section that was described in the official documentation as a field research station and that I thought of privately as a blind. Dr. Voss visited monthly for the first year, then quarterly. She brought, on 2 occasions, a small team of researchers who had been cleared at levels that apparently took 6 months to process. I was present for all of it. This had been another condition. My experience revealed something profound during those visits. Watching trained scientists encounter Bodhi for the first time was like watching people learn to see. The first visit, the researchers were so focused on documentation, cameras, audio equipment, measurement instruments, that they missed what was actually happening. Bodhi was present for that visit in the lower meadow, visible for nearly 40 minutes. The researchers got extraordinary footage. They did not notice because they were not yet calibrated to notice that Bodhi spent most of those 40 minutes not being observed, but observing them, cataloging them, deciding in his methodical and ancient way what they were. On the second visit, one of the researchers, a young woman named Dr. Chen, who had read my notebooks with an attention that showed in her questions, sat down at the edge of the meadow and put her equipment away. Just sat, empty-handed, and waited. Bodhi came within 30 feet, the closest he had been to anyone other than me in 40 years. I watched Dr. Chen's face in that moment and recognized the expression. I had worn it myself on a March night in 1981, looking out a cabin window. The expression of someone whose understanding of the world has just been permanently revised. After the second visit, I asked Dr. Chen privately what had made her put the equipment away. She said, "I read the part of your notebooks where you described the first 5 years, how long it took before he came close. What changed? It wasn't anything you did. It was what you stopped doing. You stopped performing observation. You just started being present." She paused. I figured that was worth trying. I want to be clear about this because I know it is the part of this story that most people hearing it will find hardest to believe. They did not capture him. They did not attempt to capture him. The question was raised. I was present for the meeting in which it was raised, as my agreement stipulated, and Dr. Voss shut it down with a specificity that told me she had prepared for the argument. The task force's mandate, she said, was documentation and protection. Capture was not within the mandate and would not be sought. Whether this was principle or pragmatism, I cannot tell you with certainty. What I observed was that Dr. Voss had read my 35 years of notebooks and had drawn conclusions from them about what capture would likely produce, which was, in my documented assessment, a creature who would not survive captivity. Not because he was physically fragile, because he was not built for confinement in the way that animals without his level of cognitive complexity are not built for confinement. The notebooks documented this clearly across multiple incidents where his range had been temporarily restricted by weather or injury. My observations consistently showed that Bodhi required space not just for physical survival, but for psychological coherence. When the logging came close in 1994 and his range contracted, his behavior became erratic in ways I had never seen before, and that resolved completely when the logging stopped and he could move freely again. Captivity, for a mind like his, would not be containment. It would be destruction. Dr. Voss understood this. I do not know how many arguments she had in rooms I was not in. I know what the outcome was. What I also came to understand over the months following the signing was that the task force's restraint was not only about Bodhi, it was about precedent. If there were, as Dr. Voss had suggested, other properties under monitoring for similar reasons, and she had been careful in how much she disclosed, then the protocol established for my property would shape how those situations were handled. The decision not to capture was not just a decision about one creature on 60 acres in the Cascade foothills. It was a decision about what kind of institution we wanted to be when we encountered something we didn't have a category for. I have held onto that framing. It has helped me, in the years since, to extend more trust to the process than I would have thought myself capable of in February 2019. I have thought a great deal about how to describe this without it sounding like the fantasy of a lonely old man who spent too much time alone in the forest. I will tell you what happened and let you draw your own conclusions. 3 days after the agents first arrived, after 2 days of meetings and documents, and a quality of institutional attention that I had not experienced since my ranger service, I walked out to the lower meadow at dusk, alone, no agents, who had been respectful about my request for space. Bodhi was already there. He had been using the meadow less since the SUVs came up the road. I had expected this, had explained to Dr. Voss that any change in the property's rhythm would alter his patterns temporarily. But he was there that evening at the far edge near the old firs, watching me cross the meadow. I sat down in the grass the way I had been sitting down in this meadow for 40 years. I did not speak immediately. We had always been better at silence than words. After a while, I said aloud, to the evening, to him, to whatever was listening in the way that old forests always seem to be listening, that people were going to be here now sometimes, that they were not the same as the others, that I had read the documents and I believed they meant what they said, that the land would be protected, that he would be protected, that I was sorry it had happened the way it had happened, through a blurry photograph and a nephew who couldn't keep his phone in his pocket. I told him I was 73 years old and that I did not know how many more winters I had, and that I needed to know before I ran out of them that the arrangement would survive me. He stood at the tree line and listened, his head tilted once, the specific angle I had come to associate with close attention. When I finished, he held still for a long moment. Then he walked forward slowly and stopped about 15 feet from where I was sitting. He looked at me, that long measuring look that I had spent 40 years learning to receive without flinching. Then he lowered himself with the careful deliberateness of his age and sat, not standing over me, sat at something closer to eye level. We sat in the meadow together until it was fully dark. Neither of us moved until the stars were out. I have no language for what that meant. I am not sure language is the right tool for it. What I can tell you is that when I walked back to the cabin, the quality of what I felt was not relief. It was something older and quieter than relief. It was the feeling you get when something you have been holding carefully for a very long time is finally, gently, held by more than just you. It is 2024 as I write this. I am 78 years old. My knees have reached an understanding with the terrain that involves a certain amount of negotiation, and I have accepted that the upper ridge is no longer practical. The cabin is the same. The creek runs the same. The old growth section of the property is federally protected in a designation so classified that it does not appear in any public land registry. Dr. Voss visits 4 times a year. She brought Dr. Chen on 2 of last year's visits. There is a 3rd researcher now, a man named Okafor who works in acoustic communication and whose enthusiasm for the vocalization recordings I have given him is the kind that makes me hopeful about what he will eventually understand from them. He has already identified, in the recordings from 1992 to 2001, a structural complexity in the vocalization patterns that he describes, with a careful understatement of someone who knows the weight of the claim, as consistent with intentional communication. Bodhi is old. I know this the way you know it about anything you have watched age across decades, not from a single observation, but from the accumulation of small changes, the adjustments in gait, the slightly longer rest periods, the territory that has contracted toward its center as the margins become less important. His fur has gone predominantly silver now. His movements are slower, but no less deliberate. He has been using the lower meadow more frequently in the past 2 years, and I have noticed that he arrives at times when the researchers are present, not hiding from them, not performing, but allowing himself to be seen in a way that feels, to me, like a decision. He still leaves trilliums in February. Last winter was a hard one, the kind that keeps you inside for days at a stretch and makes you aware of your own age in ways that mild winters conceal. On the 4th day of a storm that had brought 18 inches of snow to the lower meadow, I heard the knock signal from outside. 3 slow knocks on the porch post. I opened the door. Bodhi was standing in the snow 6 feet from the porch. He had not been that close to the cabin in years. In his hands, those enormous, careful hands that I have watched perform acts of precision that I still struggle to fully account for, he was holding a section of freshly broken fir branch, its needles still green and fragrant. He set it on the porch step. Then he stood up straight and looked at me and held my gaze for a moment that I will not be able to accurately report the duration of. Then he turned and walked back into the white. I brought the branch inside. I sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time. I have no interpretation to offer you. I have only the fact of it and the feeling it left behind. The same feeling I have been trying to find the right words for since March of 1981. Standing at a cabin window in the dark, watching something look back at me with what I can only call recognition. I am sharing this account now because Dr. Voss has informed me, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they know will land hard, that there are 3 other properties in the Pacific Northwest currently under task force monitoring for similar reasons. 3 other places where someone, for some period of time, made the same decision I made and tried to hold a line alone. I do not know those people. I do not know their stories. I do not know whether their situations will resolve the way mine resolved, with documents and coffee and a woman who had read the notebooks and understood what they meant. What I want to say to close this account is something about the decision I made in 1983 and whether I would make it again. The honest answer is yes, and also I understand now why it could not hold forever, and I am at peace with both of those things simultaneously. Hiding Bodhi was not an act of heroism. It was an act of love, imperfect and contingent and ultimately insufficient on its own, as most acts of love are. What it bought was time. Time for him to live undisturbed. Time for me to document what I was witnessing. Time for the world to develop incrementally the capacity for a different kind of response than the one I feared in 1983. Whether the world has actually developed that capacity is a question I am not qualified to answer. What I can tell you is that the 7 people who came up my road on a February morning in 2019 were not, in the end, what I had spent 40 years dreading. They were flawed and institutional and operating within systems I do not fully trust, but they were also in the person of Dr. Voss and in the young woman who put her camera down in the meadow and simply waited, capable of the thing I had believed only I was capable of, sitting with the extraordinary without immediately trying to own it. That is not nothing. After 40 years of sitting alone with a secret the size of a mountain, that is not nothing at all. What I know now, in my 78th year, is that the instinct to protect, to stand between something extraordinary and a world that has not yet learned how to encounter it without destroying it, is not madness, it is not delusion, but it cannot, finally, be done alone. The things worth protecting are always larger than one person's capacity to protect them. At some point, you have to find the people who have read the notebooks and let them sit in the meadow. Some of them will put their cameras down. The trilliums were early this February. Bodhi left them on a morning when the frost was still on the porch boards. Before I was awake, and by the time I came out with my coffee, they were already arranged. 7 of them in the specific cluster he has always preferred, on the top step. Dr. Chen was here for a site visit that week. I showed her the trilliums before they faded. She photographed them, not for the official record, but on her personal phone, the way you photograph things you want to remember. She asked me if he had always left them in exactly that arrangement. I told her, always. 11 February mornings in a row before this one, always 7, always this cluster. I have never found an explanation I'm satisfied with. She looked at the trilliums for a long time. Then she said, maybe it doesn't need an explanation. Maybe it just needs to be documented. I thought about that. I thought about 35 years of notebooks in a fireproof box under my floor, written in the conviction that documentation was its own form of protection, its own argument for the value of the thing being documented. I think she's right, and I think the documenting is not finished. Some things are exactly what they appear to be. After all these years, that still takes my breath away.